Do you know the people you can't win to the Lord? Or the people who already think they have the light? Just try it. You talk to somebody about the Lord? Well, I've got my own thing. I know God. Oh, well, tell me about God. And then they got some squirrely theology or some other God. But they think they have the light. In other words, the light they think they have is darkness. And Jesus said that's the greatest darkness of all. We're going through the Sermon on the Mount verse by verse. We're into session 34. This is, believe it or not, this is the 34th class or teaching from the Sermon on the Mount. Tonight, I want to talk to you about a kingdom value system. A kingdom value system. The first 18 verses of Matthew 6 are all about spiritual things. Fasting, praying, giving, and then he teaches the Lord's Prayer. So he's been in a section of the sermon where he's talking about spiritual things. But beginning with verse 19, he begins to talk about our relationship with the world. You know, we all should read our Bibles, pray, meditate, give, and it should be done in secret in the sense that we don't do it before men. We do it for God. We want to be seen by God. We don't want to make a show, but we live in a real world. I think most of us get through the worship service without having any thoughts of lust or temptation to do anything evil, but we don't stay in service. We got to go out of here. And Saturday nights and Sunday mornings are great, but we got to go to work on Monday. And Jesus is practical. He understands that. So he's going to now move from talking about what the normal Christian life looks like in our piety or our spiritual dimension. Now he's going to talk about how we relate to the world, a world that's full of trouble, worry, and fear, and a world system that seeks to suck us into itself. Here's what Lloyd Jones says in his great book, Studies in the Sermon on the Mount. I'm going to quote him a lot tonight. If you don't have this book, Studies in the Sermon on the Mount by David Martin Lloyd Jones, I've read it 20 times. I've had it 40 years. It is one of the greatest Christian books ever written. And I would recommend you read it once a year because his insights are as profound as any. So I quote him a lot because he's my hero. He says, one of the most subtle problems the Christian must deal with is his relationship to this world. You pray and fast and give alms unobserved, but you also have to live your life in the world. And that world will do its best to get you down. It will do its utmost to ruin your spiritual life, so you have to be wary. And that's what Jesus is talking about here, beginning in Matthew 6, verse 19. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures upon earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Now, when we hear the word treasure, we think, show me the money. And he certainly includes that thought. But the Greek word translated treasure in English is from the Greek word that thesauros, which means wealth. So it's not just money, but it's anything that we value. It could be money, property. It could be even people or relationships. It's bigger than just the idea of cash or money. And when we come to that, we think about value systems. You know, I would really recommend you think about value systems. What do you think of when you hear that term? Listen, this is something that you can spend some time on. Do you realize that all of life is decision making? I did some study on this. They say we make 5,000 decisions a day. Most of them are just so quick and easy, we don't think about it. Think about that. But of the 5,000, some of them involve rational planning or actual deciding where we have to, and we choose according to what we value. We all live according to a value system. For example, I have a wallet, and in it, there's some money, not a lot, but there's some. And I value this money. I'm certainly not going to be careless with my wallet. It has value. I value it. But when my car is running on empty, I value the gasoline more than the money. So I give up the money to get the gasoline. When I'm trying to decide what I'm going to do, and I have something that over here that I can do, but there's also this over here I can do. I have to, whether I'm thinking about it or not, I am valuing those two options, and then I'll choose the one according to my value system. Jesus says to value or treasure in heaven more than we are to value treasure or wealth on earth. Again, Lloyd Jones, our treasure may not be money. It may be a husband, a wife, or children. It may be some gift we have. No matter what it is or how small it is, if it is everything to you, that is your treasure. That's the thing you are living for. This is the danger the Lord warns about here. You know, when you pastor and you work with people, you love people, you work with people, you really observe a lot of interesting things. I have seen people who value keeping their money in their bank more than they do paying their tithe. I see some who value their children's entertainments more than they do faithful attendance to the house of God. And I'm not criticizing, I'm just being real here. I mean, there are people who have a sense of need to go be in the house of the Lord and hear the word, worship the Lord, give an offering. They have a sense of that. But this culture today, the children can pull so hard. It's quick. Many have people quick to just say, well, you know what? I want them happy. I want them to be able to not miss the soccer game or whatever. I don't know. It's a value system. And many prefer the applause of men over the approval of God. And that is very much in our church culture today. Again, Dr. Jones says some cannot be tempted by money, but they can be tempted by status and position. Promotion has done endless harm in the church of God. I could just stop and preach on that. I mean, if I could go back, this is true. When people, young men who are going to the ministry, they say, you know, what's the most important thing or what's the biggest thing you've learned? I said, well, one of the things I've learned in 35, 40 years of pastoring people is don't promote people too quick. I mean, even good people. I promoted people too quick because I trust them, I love them, I believe in them. But boy, when you give some people a title, you give them an inch, they think they're a ruler. And I literally have lost relationships where at the end of the day, I have had to look at more than one man and say, you know, you're a good man and I love you, but I didn't do you right. I promoted you when I shouldn't have, and you weren't ready to handle it. And I'm not criticizing you, I'm criticizing me. Well, that gets deep. He says, endless harm in the church has been done to men who have been quite honest and sincere, but who have not been on guard against this danger. How many good men have fallen in love with the title? And that title whether it's elder or deacon or pastor, they value that more than they do. They forget they're there to serve God and his people. Very subtle. Lloyd Jones says, many a preacher has been ruined by his congregation. There's two perils for pastors. Let me give you some inside baseball, okay? One is we can fall in love with the praise of the people and slip into pride. Or worse, we can put so much value on pleasing the people that we end up watering down the word of God. Today we live in a world where the watchword is political correctness. I don't think any of us realized when this started to really raise its head in the culture what a demon this thing was going to become. Really. My earliest recollection, and you're going to laugh at this, but this is like 40 years ago. Our pastor in Little Rock was preaching a sermon, and he used the term Indian giver. He said, God is not an Indian giver. Well, sure enough, somebody in the congregation was an Indian and felt like he was insulting the integrity of Indians who will give you something and then take it back. And I remember thinking at the time, I said, that's nuts. That's kind of crazy. And that's 40 years ago. Boy, it's a lot worse than that now. Man, you have to watch every little word today. And don't get me wrong, we should mind our speech, and we should guard our tongues against speaking words that would offend or put somebody down needlessly. But man, when you're called to preach the word, I mean, I read the word every day and it offends me because I got my ideas of what I want to do and how I want to live, and God has other ideas, and he doesn't mind offending me at all. So if you're called to preach, and if you keep giving in to the political correctness in the church, first thing you know, like one said, the church has become so worldly and the world has become so churchy that you can't tell the difference. Alan Hirsch is an Australian, a Messianic Jew who leads church missiologists studies. He says, unless the church is willing to embrace the values and vision of the kingdom, and turn away from materialism, consumerism, greed, and the power of this present age, it not only abandons its biblical mandate, but it's rendered missionally ineffective. In other words, when we get ourselves to that place where we water things down to the point where we look so much like the world, we can't win the world. We'll never win the world by being like the world. I wish we could just learn that. There's a difference, people say, well, I want to be seeker friendly. Well, I don't want to be seeker unfriendly. But we have to maintain a standard. I mean, are we going to lower God's bar so that we can be more appealing? Well, what will we end up with? Well, I'm just moving right along, aren't I? Materialism, the world is all about money. Consumerism, he says, the world is all about acquiring more things. Jesus is warning about the all-powerful pull of the world system, but our treasure is supposed to be in heaven. And I love the rational reason. Jesus doesn't just say, hey, just trust me. Look what he says about why this makes sense. Why should I lay up treasure in heaven, value that above my treasure on earth? Because treasure on earth is temporary, subject to corruption and theft. Treasure in heaven is eternal. It's guarded by God. It can never be lost. Earthly treasures don't last. They can be gone overnight. And wouldn't you know, I'm working on this message all week with Hurricane Harvey fallout everywhere. It's the costliest natural disaster in the history of the United States. The costliest. Oh, what about Katrina? It will dwarf Katrina, trust me. The latest estimates say it'll be over $200 billion in damage. And that's just dollars. That doesn't count the human suffering, loss of life, property. We have, of course, family. We're from the Gulf Coast. Lizzie and I have been through a number of hurricanes over our younger years. And my family lost our home and our family car in 1960 when I was a junior in high school. We had 3 feet of water in the house, Hurricane Carla. We were in Freeport, Texas. Waited 9 blocks to get to the house. Inside, the water was over knee deep. Everything. You see, when you build on a slab, the subflooring gets wet and the boards swell up and arch, and the pressure pushes the foundations of the walls off the foundation of the house. So the house is a total loss. You get salt water in an engine car block. The engine block of a car's gone. Car's gone. Hundreds of car dealerships were underwater. Think of it. 500 car dealerships, 1,000 cars apiece, each worth an average of $30,000, gone. Larry's right. It won't be months. It'll be years. We've been there. We've seen it. And I was just thinking all this week as I've prayed for the situation, I've prayed for these people. We have family down there still, and thank God they're all right. Her brother in Houston, house is dry. Her sister's in Lafayette, Louisiana, houses are dry. But even if your house wasn't dry, or wasn't wet, if your house was dry, you realize it's worth 40% less today than it was a week ago. See, we never think about that. Because when you have that devastation, all the property values go down. You thought you had $200,000 equity in your house? No, you got $120,000. And that's never calculated by people. And I kept thinking about people who might have put, just sacrificed to pay their house off. They might have been put in thousands of dollars of remodeling. Maybe they just finished redoing adding a room or building onto the house, and now it's gone. Who would have thought it? And this flood insurance, when we were growing up, you couldn't buy flood insurance except through Lloyd's of London. That was the only place Gulf Coast residents could get flood coverage. Rising water, they won't cover. Why? Because it's a risk. You can get wind damage. If the wind blows your roof off and the water comes in, they'll reimburse you. But if it's rising water, you can't get anything. Now today they have this FEMA thing where you can get a very limited form of water damage, flood damage, but it won't cover 10%. My heart just breaks. But could we ever have had a better illustration of how things can go? How the things that we value, things we really care about. I guarantee there's no floods in heaven. There's no hurricanes in heaven. There's no devil breaking through and stealing. There's no corruption. Wade into your house with 3 feet of water and open your refrigerator door after 4 days. You'll get a real dose of what rot and corruption really is. Let me move quickly because I'm tired. No. Value system, there's 3 things here. Where's your heart? How's your eyesight? And whom are you serving? Let me cover these. First of all, where's your heart? He says, for where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. I'll never forget this. Many years ago, before I was a pastor, I had a man of God challenge me one day. He said, how are your values? I said, how do you know how to check your value system? I said, I think you're going to tell me. He said, yeah. He said, look at your checkbook. See where you spend your money. Boy, I tell you what, I've never heard a better way to check What do you spend your money on? Because that's what you value. Let's face it, we all value money, and we don't give it up easy. We don't just write checks. So if you want to know, see where you're putting your money. And I'm not trying to make anybody feel guilty. We all have a house payment or a rent to pay. We all have food to buy. We have clothes we need, etc. I'm not talking about that. I'm just saying it is a sign, though, of where it goes. You know, I thank God the Baptists taught me one very good thing about tithing. So over the years, you can go in my Quicken or in my checkbook and you can see the day I make a deposit, the first check I write after I make my deposit, whatever it is, I write the tithe check. Boom, boom, boom. That's a message, okay? I value this first. Seek ye first the kingdom of God. Tithe is not 10%, by the way. It's the first 10%. If it's not the first 10%, it's not a tithe. People say, well, I'm going to wait till the end of the month, and if I have enough money left over, I'll pay my tithe. I said, well, you can pay your 10%, but it ain't your tithe because you have to pay that on the front end. But if I pay it on the front end, how do I know I have enough to get through the end? That's called faith. Isn't it just elementary what we need to say? Jesus just says, do a heart exam. Where your treasure is, that's where your heart is. Number 2, how's your eyesight? Verse 22 and 23, your eye is the lamp that provides light for the body. When your eye is good, your whole body is filled with light. But when your eye is bad, your whole body is filled with darkness. And if the light you think you have is actually darkness, how deep that darkness is. He says the eyes are the light of the body. That's where the light. He says you can have good eyesight or bad eyesight. You can have a good eye or an evil eye. The great Matthew Henry said, the eye refers to our aims, our intentions, the ends we set before us, the mark we shoot at. With that in view, we direct our motion. It's is my eye on earthly treasure or is my eye on heavenly treasure? That's what he's talking about. And I think that's one of the scariest, and you can meditate on this one for a long time. He said, if the light you think you have is actually darkness, it's the deepest darkness of all. Do you know the people you can't win to the Lord? Or the people who already think they have the light? Just try it. You talk to somebody about the Lord, well, I've got my own thing. I know God. Oh, well, tell me about God. And then they got some squirrely theology or some other God, but they think they have the light. In other words, the light they think they have is darkness, and Jesus said that's the greatest darkness of all. I mean, if you think you know the truth and you don't, to the degree that you know the truth so much you won't listen to anything else, it's sinister, it's demonic. The ultimate deception is to mistake the light for darkness. Or darkness for light. I've seen too many leave God's church to pursue some new revelation, and they end up shipwrecking their faith. Too many pastors who used to believe the Bible have now caved into cultural pressure, this gay is okay thing. There's now hundreds of churches in America where the pastors are saying gay is okay. Well, I have new light. I used to believe the other way, but now I have new light. I have news for you, sir. What you're calling light is darkness, and because you don't know the difference, you're in the greatest darkness you can be in. And I don't condemn you or judge you. I pray for you, for your soul. So, value system, right? Where's your heart? How's your eyesight? And finally, who are you serving? Who are you serving? Verse 24. No one can serve two masters. Either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will hold to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. Now, when you meditate on that, he's actually saying there's two masters. There's God and mammon. You know my favorite Bob Dylan song? You gotta serve somebody. It may be the devil or it may be the Lord, but you gotta serve somebody. It's true. You gotta serve. Well, what about people just serve themselves? It's the same thing as mammon. That's powerful thought. You cannot serve. It's impossible. Dr. Jones says this last step is the most solemn and serious of all. We must remember that the way in which we look at these things ultimately determines our very relationship with God. No man can serve two masters. Either he'll hate the one and love the other, or he'll hold to the one and despise the other, because both make a totalitarian demand upon us. Boy, think about that. Both. It's not like God says, just give me a little of you. Give me your leftovers. Give me what you're willing to give me. Read the New Testament. It's a radical demand that God makes upon us. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy mind, with all thy spirit. Totalitarian demand means we must choose one or the other, and it can't be both. He goes on to say God and mammon are both totalitarian. Both demand entire allegiance, and therefore they cannot be mixed. We cannot love two opposite things at the same time. Love is exclusive. It is demanding and always insists upon the absolute. Oh, Pastor Ray, I think we can love two things at the same time. I love God. I also love hot dogs. He's talking here about opposites. You cannot love two opposite things at the same time, if you're honest. Even in his day, Lloyd Jones says, is not this the trouble with the church? That for many a day, she's been trying to mix certain incompatibilities. It's this constant compromising, promising in the life of the church that has been her ruination since the days of Constantine. Once you have lost the division between the world and the church ceases to be truly Christian. Okay? I've said a beardful. I don't even have a beard. It's a value system. How many of you see that? We can't stay in here. We can't stay in our prayer closet. We have to go out in the world. And the world will force us to make choices. And we make those choices according to value system. Where are we going to put our treasure? Where are we going to lay up our treasure? What is our eyesight telling us our goals and aims should be? Who are we really serving? Those are the value systems of the kingdom. Remember, if you've been with us since January, from the beginning, the Beatitudes forward, the Christian is different from the world. Everything in those Beatitudes, remember, it's the opposite of the spirit of the world. We got so many today. I'm a Christian, but they're not poor in spirit. They're not meek. They're not humble. They're not peacemakers. They don't mourn over their sin. But real believers do. It's the normal Christian life. Right on forward. Real believers know the difference between God and mammon. They understand the values of putting something up in heaven rather than laying it up on earth. And boy, do we need this message today. We have a very worldly, church in our country. And that's not new. You know, sometimes I get amused at people who look at what's going on. They say, oh, it's getting worse and worse. It's never been this bad. You don't know history. I'm sorry, but you really don't. People say, well, just look at all that's happening. It's bad. I admit it's bad. We got all this weather weirdness, and we got North Korea, we got Iran, we got the Taliban, we got all this stuff going on. A lot of hatred, racial unrest. It's bad. It's bad. Folks, the world has gone through many, many things worse than this. I'll close with one of my favorite quotes. Thomas Linacre was the physician to Henry VIII back in the 1500s. And you know how corrupt the church was under Henry. He actually, became the head of the church and had the fallout with Rome and, all of that. Well, Thomas Linacre was one of the smartest men in England. I mean, he spoke different languages. He read hundreds of books, but he had never been a Christian. He didn't get saved till he was like in middle age. And he could read Latin, original Latin. So he read the Gospels in Latin for the first time. And this is what he said. Either these are not the Gospels, or we are not Christians. Either these are not the Gospels, or we are not Christians. They can't both be true. I would hold that very standard up today before the Church of Jesus Christ in the United States of America, and I say, if these are the Gospels, are you really a believer? You say, well, I don't know if I measure up to that. Well, you know what? Surrender to God. Surrender to God.